upon the first negative speaker, Sebastian Beretta.
Good evening, Madam Chair, adjudicators and members of the audience. The topic for tonight's debate is that Australia should not allow the repatriation of ISIS brides and their children. We, the negative team, believe this to be vehemently false and completely disagree with it. I begin by accepting the definition provided by the affirmative. However, we would like to emphasise that their children to be the children of the ISIS brides and their husbands, regardless of where they were born. Therefore, we define this topic as that Australia should not permit the entry of women and children who are citizens of Australia that travel to Iraq and Syria to join the Islamic State. As the negative team, we absolutely disagree with this statement. To argue this point, I, the first speaker, will first rebut the first affirmative speaker's points and then be presenting two main points, that the ISIS brides and their children are victims and blameless, and that the repatriation of the ISIS brides and their children will prevent further radicalisation. Our second speaker, Vijay, will be talking about Australia's legal obligation by domestic and international law to repatriate ISIS brides and their children. Our third speaker, Zach, will rebut and summarise our team's case. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that victims of ISIS need to be brought to justice, and that the ISIS brides and their children need to suffer and be imprisoned because of this. This is false. They are not the perpetrators. They are actually the victims and blameless. The perpetrators of ISIS are men. They were the ones in control, and the ISIS brides were instead emotionally manipulated, and if they were already married, dragged along to go to Syria and Iraq. The first affirmative speaker also told you that they must take responsibility for their actions. That essentially that adult decisions must be brought on with adult consequences. This is false. The women were not, as I've mentioned, the women were not the ones doing the violent acts due to the ISIS's repressive system, and not allowing them is a blanket idea and includes the kids who are objectively innocent, as I will further discuss. Additionally, the first affirmative speaker told you that people will be scared due to the ISIS brides and their children coming to Australia. This has no statistical backing and is a harsh generalisation fallacy with no statistical backing, and the third negative speaker will further expand upon this. Now to my first point, that the ISIS brides and their children are effectively blameless. Behind the headlines of ISIS brides and foreign fighters are human beings, particularly women and children. First and foremost, these children are innocent. Many were born into war zones, into refugee camps, into conditions that they had no choice over whatsoever. According to Save the Children, more than 60% of the 55,000 people in the Al-Hol camp in Syria are children, and nearly half of them are under 12. To condemn them to a lifetime of danger and suffering because of their parents' decisions would be profoundly unjust. In Australia, we do not punish children for crimes they did not commit, so why should these Australian citizens be punished specifically? These young Australians deserve safety, education, and the opportunity to grow free from extremism. We must also consider our view of the ISIS brides. These women are not inherently perpetrators. In many cases, they were victims themselves. Victims of oppressive culture, victims of coercive control, and victims of systemic grooming. Research conducted by the International Centre for Study of Radicalisation, a London-based non-profit, non-governmental think tank, demonstrates that women recruited to ISIS were teenagers, some as young as 15 or 16, manipulated with promises of belonging, or even forced into marriages against their will. Additionally, they were excluded from power, stripped of agency, and in many cases exploited by the very organisation we now condemn them for being associated with. To assume that all these women are dangerous or less deserving of our help is to ignore reality. They are victims of ISIS, not its architects. They did not shape its policies, nor did they have authority over its atrocities. What they endured instead was exploitation, coercion, and in many cases, violence. If there are women who did commit these crimes, let them be investigated and tried fairly in Australia under Australian law. We must start from the position that individuals are innocent until proven guilty, not assume collective guilt. Now, onto my second point, that the repatriation of ISIS brides and their children is not a risk. The affirmative would like you to believe that we should not repatriate ISIS brides and their children. However, refusing the repatriation actually makes Australia less safe, not more. Let me explain why. First, radicalisation is managed far better here in Australia than overseas. When we refuse the entry into the country of these women and children, we are essentially telling them that they are villains and that they are unwanted by their own country, Australia. This rejection breeds resentment, and resentment breeds hate. If they are left stranded in refugee or detention camps such as Syria, such as Al-Hol or Al-Rol, these women and children are exposed daily to extremist networks, propaganda, and complete hopelessness. According to Professor Greg Barson, Global Islamic Politics Professor at Deakin University, these conditions become a breeding ground for more radicalisation, not less. The more radicalisation that we allow to occur by preventing repatriation, the more we risk a re-emergence of ISIS. By contrast, bringing them home means they can be monitored, engaged with, and importantly, de-radicalised in a controlled, safer environment. Australian institutes like the Department of Home Affairs and the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, offer effective de-radicalisation programs and fantastic law enforcement capacity, institutions that do not exist in conflict zones in Syria. A Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security report in 2022 confirmed that Australia has the capacity to manage returning women and children safely. This can be seen with the ISIS brides and children who have already been repatriated, both to Australia and to other countries internationally. According to the Department of Home Affairs, 4 women and 21 children have already been repatriated to Australia from Syria from 2019 to 2022. They are not looking for trouble. According to SBS, these women subjugated themselves to voluntary order through working with Australian authorities to help their reintegration into society, despite having no legal obligation to do so. This works. According to ABC, aside from one woman who was charged for alleged crimes committed while affiliated with ISIS, none of these repatriated women or children have committed any major crimes since they returned to Australia. This demonstrates that repatriation does not inherently lead to further criminal activity and that instead these individuals can reintegrate peacefully into society. This can be seen on an international scale too, according to the Human Rights Watch. This can be seen from their publicly available records. The crime rate for repatriated citizens, numbering around 3,300 repatriated brides and children worldwide, is far lower than global average crime rates, and even compared to developed countries like Australia, with 1% in 2023. This is undeniable proof that the repatriation of ISIS brides and their children does not pose a risk and can instead lead to a prevention of further radicalisation. In conclusion, the affirmative would have you believe that Australia should not allow the repatriation of ISIS brides and their children, but we have shown that the opposite is true. These women and children are not criminals by default. They are Australian citizens, many of them victims of coercion, grooming and circumstance. These children are innocent, deserving of safety and opportunity. Additionally, repatriation does not weaken Australia's security. It strengthens it by preventing further radicalisation and allowing our institutions to monitor, engage with, and when necessary, prosecute individuals under Australian law. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Andre Dogan.
Good evening, Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that Australia should not allow the repatriation of ISIS brides and their children. We, the affirmative team, strongly believe this statement is true. Tonight, as the second affirmative speaker, I'll discuss 2 points. First, that the economic burden of repatriating ISIS brides and their children is far too great to justify. Second, if de-radicalisation of these ISIS brides and children fail, it will severely undermine our social cohesion. Our third speaker, Amira, will rebut and summarise our team case. Now to my rebuttals. The first speaker presented the notion that the brides are the victims and therefore should be repatriated. This idea is flawed, as it's too simplistic to assume all women are the victims. In fact, according to the Royal Air Force Centre for Air Power Studies, there are many cases where women have played a crucial role in the recruitment of ISIS fighters in order to recruit other women and children. This involvement shows that women's roles went beyond victimhood, that they were the key players in expanding ISIS influence. The first speaker also argued that if we don't repatriate them here, where they are in Australia, that we should leave them there. Bringing radicalised individuals home without rigorous de-radicalisation and monitoring programs doesn't neutralise the risk, it relocates it. According to the Combating Terrorism Centre at West Point, over 5,600 men, women and children from 33 countries have returned from Syria and Iraq, with many of these returnees being involved in deadly attacks in Europe. We have a duty to protect innocent civilians first, not gamble with national security in the hope that the most dangerous will simply reform. The first speaker argued that because the children and brides are innocent, we must repatriate them. Innocence doesn't guarantee safety. Many ISIS brides actively support terrorist activities, while children may have been exposed to extremist ideologies. We must protect our national security. The first speaker tried to tell you that we can safely repatriate children and brides here, yet the 2023 ASIO report says differently, which I'll say further in my speech. Now to my prepared remarks. My first point is that the economic burden of repatriating ISIS brides and their children is far too great to justify. Repatriating these individuals is not as simple as flying them to Australia, but rather a complex, costly and resource-intensive process. The costs go well beyond transport. These individuals require intensive security monitoring, ongoing psychological care, social services and educational programs to support reintegration. These aren't one-off expenses, they're long-term financial commitments borne by Australian taxpayers. In October 2022, Australia repatriated 4 women and 13 children from Syria, including Reynella, who has since been charged under Australian law for entering ISIS-controlled territory. According to Australian Federal Police Commissioner Reece Kershaw, monitoring a single one of these individuals would cost up to $4 million per year and involve 300 police officers. That's just for security monitoring. This is all paid by Australian taxpayers, everyday people who go to work, obey the law, pay their taxes, and live by our egalitarian values. These quiet Australians are now being asked to fund the reintegration of individuals who align themselves with a terrorist organisation. That's not right, that's not justice. It's a betrayal of the hard-working Australians who are now expected to foot the bill. The opposition may argue that we have a moral obligation to bring those women and children back. But what about our moral obligation to help our people here at home? According to the Royal Air Force Centre for Air Power Studies, many of these women played an active and critical role in ISIS recruitment. They weren't passive bystanders, but active supporters of a terrorist regime that is in stark contrast to Australian values. Meanwhile, Australians at home, according to the Australian Financial Review, are struggling amid a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, and the biggest fall in living standards in the developed world. How can we justify helping those who betrayed our country while so many Australians are left behind and in need? As the saying goes, charity begins here at home. The sheer economic costs of repatriating these individuals and costs to the taxpayers at a time when Australians are struggling to make ends meet completely misses the mood of the nation. We must prioritise our duty to help Australians who are doing the right thing, rather than reward those who go against everything our nation was ever meant to stand for. My second point is that if de-radicalisation of these ISIS brides and children fail, it will severely undermine our social cohesion. De-radicalisation, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is a process of making someone less radical in their extreme views. Its aim is to rehabilitate individuals so they can adopt modern beliefs and contribute positively to society. Social cohesion refers to keeping social harmony in society, that we all belong, feel safe and are valued equally. De-radicalisation of these individuals is never guaranteed, and when it fails, the ramifications are catastrophic. It puts innocent lives at risk and harms the fabric of our nation. The opposition may claim that de-radicalisation programs are effective. The contrary has been found true, as one single failure can lead to horrific consequences. Take Usman Khan, for example, who completed the UK's de-radicalisation program called Learning Together before murdering 2 people at London Bridge in 2019. In a similar program, Arid Yukar underwent Germans' de-radicalisation programs and then killed 2 American airmen in a terror shooting at Frankfurt Airport in 2011. Most importantly though, according to the Lowly Institute, Australia has no long-term outcome data about ISIS returnees. That means we're not just taking a risk, we're running a social experiment using Australian lives as test subjects. The ASIO 2023 report revealed a sobering truth. De-radicalisation is not only costly and uncertain, but far less reliable than prevention. Preventing radicalisation before it takes root is not just effective, it actively protects our society from risks that should never be allowed to reach our community. And yet, despite this clear warning, we're being asked to take a chance. So we must ask ourselves, what if that chance backfires? What if just one young 12-year-old child or ISIS bride is not properly de-radicalised? We witness the global repercussions of sleeper cells. Think of 9/11, where individuals lived among society for months upon months before launching their attacks that inevitably changed the world. Are we really prepared for that to happen to us again on our shores? Imagine waking up one morning to the awful news that the Sydney Opera House has been bombed or Parliament House in Canberra is under siege, all because we welcome a Trojan horse through our own gates and only realised too late what was inside. If we get this wrong, there is no rewind button. One failure is all it takes. That's why we must draw the line at repatriation before a ticking time bomb becomes Australia's undoing. In conclusion, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, repatriating ISIS brides and their children burns struggling taxpayers and puts our safety at risk. Failed de-radicalisation isn't just a risk, it's a wrecking ball to our social cohesion. When human lives are on the line, second chances are a gamble we simply cannot afford. I thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Vijay Vigneswaran.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that Australia should not allow the repatriation of ISIS brides and children. We as a negative team believe this statement is absolutely false. As a second negative speaker, I will recap the points of our first speaker, Seb, and convince you that Australia should uphold our legal obligation to repatriate ISIS brides and children. But first, I will rebut the negative team's case. Now, the first affirmative case. Now, the first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that there will be a ridiculous security risk that we cannot risk. However, there is absolutely no evidence of women and children who have been repatriated after joining ISIS, after being affiliated with ISIS. There's no evidence of them committing any major crime across the world. There have been 3,300 citizens across the world that have been repatriated from ISIS, from camps because they have been affiliated with ISIS. However, not a single one has committed a major crime. She has also claimed that there will be billions wasted, however has provided us with no evidence that any money will be wasted, and certainly not billions of dollars will be wasted. She has also claimed that Australian citizens have abandoned their citizenship. Now, may I remind you, these children had no involvement in abandoning their citizenship. They had no involvement in going at all. Many of them were actually born in these camps or in Syria. And regardless, their citizenship has not been abandoned. No one's citizenship can be simply revoked if they are purely an Australian citizen, as I will delve into later. We can consider, now the second affirmative speaker has attempted to tell you that repatriation equals reintegration. It simply doesn't. Risk does not have to necessarily reach community. The topic is that we will allow that we should not allow the repatriation, not that we should not allow the reintegration. Let's take David Hicks, for example. He was a known convicted terrorist, not a wife of a terrorist, not a child of a terrorist. He was a known convicted terrorist. And he was convicted in the United States, convicted, unlike these women and children, and he was repatriated, and he was prosecuted. He's currently in prison facing his consequences. Repatriation does not equal reintegration, as the affirmative team have tried to tell you. Now, we must consider this. Now, the second affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you that, that it is unwise that Australian taxpayers support these repatriated citizens. These are Australians being supported by Australians. These women and children you cannot claim are not Australian, as they are Australian citizens. This is no different to any other Australian being supported by taxpayers. It has also claimed that we should not do this because we're in a cost of living crisis. Yes, but these Australians in our role in Syria are in a humanitarian crisis. His argument is also based on these hypotheticals and appeals to emotion, claiming that something could happen in the future. But we must look at the facts. 3,300 women and children have been repatriated from ISIS across the world. Not a single one has committed a major crime. Now, to summarise our first speaker, Seb's points. He's already explained to you why ISIS brides and children should be repatriated and to be treated as victims, not as perpetrators of ISIS. He has also explained why there is no risk associated with repatriating ISIS brides and children, but that there is a great risk of radicalisation by leaving them in Syria. Now to my argument, where I will cover 2 points. One, that Australia cannot legally deny the repatriation of ISIS brides and children, and that Australians should repatriate ISIS brides and children because we owe them a right of due process, as we do for every other citizen. Now to my first point, may I present to you the citizenship dilemma. Now the premise of this dilemma is that under Australian law and under international law, Australia cannot disallow the repatriation of ISIS brides and children. This is because the government as of today only has 2 realistic options to disallow it. One, that they disallow the repatriation of citizens, this violates domestic law, or 2, that they revoke citizenship to avoid repatriation. This violates international law. Either way, the Australian government to disallow repatriation will be breaking the law. We as the negative team say no, the Australian government should not break the law to infringe upon the rights of citizens, and this infringement will risk the rights of all Australian citizens. Now I'll explore option 1, why disallowing repatriation violates domestic law. As defined for this topic in regards to repatriation, we're specifically discussing Australian citizens, whether they be by birthright or naturalisation. In regard to denying the repatriation of Australian citizens, the Department of Home Affairs make their stance evidently clear. They state, and I quote from their website, if you are an Australian citizen, you have an automatic right of entry into Australia. Not conditional on family, not conditional on past crimes, an automatic right. This right has been entrenched in Australia, in Australian common law since 1908 in the case of Potter v Minahan, where the High Court ruled that in favour of preventing arbitrary prevention of repatriation of all Australian citizens. It is our stance as the negative team that Australia should continue to uphold this right to protect the rights of ISIS brides and children, but also to protect the rights of all Australian citizens who find themselves at our international borders. There is only one way of avoiding this law, however, which is revoking a citizenship, which leads me to option 2, that the Australian government disallows repatriation by revoking the citizenship. And Australia, since 1973, when we ratified 1961's Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness, promised to the world that we as a nation will never revoke an Australian citizenship if it will leave that citizen stateless. Now that's why repatriation measures are still ongoing, because Australia has this legal obligation to these citizens and to not make them stateless, as they are solely Australian citizens. Therefore, by both domestic and international law, Australia is obliged to repatriate ISIS brides and children. Disagreeing advocates that Australia breaks our promises on a global humanitarian scale or violate a law that has been established to protect the right of every single Australian. Now to my second point, that preventing the detainment of ISIS brides and children in Syria by allowing repatriation guarantees their right of due process, a right that we should and a right that we must uphold. Due process is a citizen's entitlement of notice of what they're being charged with and a hearing before receiving impartial judgment. Now, Australian citizens currently held in our role in Syria are not under control of the Syrian government, but rather a Kurdish-led political and military entity known as the AANES. This entity has not offered our citizens a right of their due process, nor have they even charged them with any crimes, yet they are being forcibly and inhumanely detained. These camps treat children not as victims of their environment, but as criminals. They are being indefinitely detained in an open-air prison that fails to provide Australians with the ability to exercise their rights. Every single Australian citizen has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And repatriation, given the absence of these legal conditions and due process that I just mentioned, is the only way to guarantee this right. Now, allowing repatriation is a statement that we as Australians will not deny the legal and moral responsibility of protecting the rights of our citizens, and that will not outsource that responsibility to an autonomous non-state entity to do our dirty work because our laws don't apply there. And if Australia wishes to charge these women and children still in Syria for crimes upon repatriation, which they have not yet, we as a nation have every right to do so. As I said before, repatriation does not equal reintegration, but we must prioritise this as legal prosecution if we are to do so, not arbitrary persecution, which leaving them in Syria it involves. Now, Australia has only been able to prosecute one woman, as the affirmative team mentioned, Mariam Rad, of these 25 citizens already repatriated, and she's currently showing 25 months of good behaviour for entering a terrorist-controlled area. However, nor did she nor any other Australian commit any crimes in Australia after repatriation. We must handle this prosecution and rehabilitation in these ways where we can allow guarantee this right of due process. Now to my conclusion, Australia should allow this repatriation because not only do we have a legal obligation to, but we have this moral obligation to uphold this right of due process and guarantee and protect the rights of all Australians. We must show that justice is not conditional. We must answer this plea of ISIS brides and children and allow their repatriation. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Amira Ali.
Good evening, Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that Australia should not allow the repatriation of ISIS brides and children. We, the affirmative team, stand resolutely behind this position because we believe the government's highest duty is protecting innocent people from documented threats. Let me be crystal clear from the outset. This policy is based solely on evidence-based security assessment and victim protection, not race, ethnicity, or religion. We're discussing individuals who made documented choices to join or support a genocidal organization that systematically murdered Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, and secular communities alike. ISIS targeted people of all backgrounds who refused their extremist ideology, making this fundamentally about protecting potential victims from willing perpetrators. On to my rebuttals. The first opposition speaker argues that many of these women were trafficked or coerced victims rather than willing participants in ISIS activities. But this is a dangerous post hoc rationalization, creating a false dichotomy between victim and perpetrator. Evidence shows otherwise. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute social media analysis of 2019 found 89% of Australian ISIS women actively recruited others over 18 months, celebrating atrocities without coercion. The FBI notes genuine trafficking victims don't engage in prolonged propaganda campaigns. Europol data shows returned women attempted recruitment in 67% of monitored cases. Zara Duman's 2015 post, "Every morning I wake up and I thank Allah for bringing me to the land of the Caliphate," confirms willing participation. We can support genuine trafficking victims through $15 million in specialized international programs while maintaining security, but victimhood cannot shield those who perpetrate violence. Yazidi survivors deserve protection from the very people who tormented them. The first opposition speaker has also claimed that children will be further radicalized if left in refugee camps. But that's like worrying a cancer patient might catch a cold while you're preparing to inject them directly into a healthy body. Their concern masks a dangerous false choice. It ignores both effectiveness of camp-based interventions and risks the important radicalized youth into Australian communities. The opposition assumes Australian integration is the only way to prevent radicalization, but this collapses under scrutiny. UN refugee assessments from 2023 show specialized camp-based de-radicalization programs achieve 43% of success under professional oversight in controlled environments. These programs can be expanded with international funding without importing participants into vulnerable communities. The Department of Education reports from 2023 link returned ISIS children to a 23% in extremist incidents in nearby Australian schools. They act as vectors for ideological transmission, validating extremist narratives among impressionable youth. ASIO's report of further notes returnees' stories appear in 89% of media recruitment materials targeting Australian youth on social media. Repatriation amplifies radicalization, giving terrorists authentic narratives to exploit. The opposition's plan sacrifices Australian children's safety to protect foreign nationals, an inversion of government responsibility that places outsiders above domestic citizens and contradicts democratic and parental duties. The second opposition speaker argues that international law obliges Australia to repatriate ISIS members. That is a dangerous cherry-picking. International law prohibits genocide, requiring states to protect populations from terrorism and compels preventions of crime against humanity. Article 51 of the UN Charter explicitly recognizes the inherent right of self-defense. The UN Resolution 60/1, the responsibility to protect doctrine, demands states defend their population from mass atrocities. The European Court of Human Rights in Othman versus UK upheld governments' rights to deny services to individuals posing security threats. Australia's Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security confirmed there is no legal binding obligation to repatriate terrorist suspects. Let's do the math. 12 million in regional humanitarian aid can be delivered remotely, while our first obligation is to safeguard the 25 million Australians from the mass casualty risk posed by just 80 suspected returnees. International law cuts both ways. These individuals forfeited protection when they joined an organization that the UN recognized as genocidal in Resolution 2178. If the opposition wants to waive legal obligations, they must accept the full package, protecting our citizens first. Which law requires Australia to import architects of genocide into the very communities they sought to destroy? Repatriation is national suicide dressed as legal compliance. The second opposition speaker also claimed that these citizens deserve due process through Australian courts, regardless of their overseas activities. But this argument assumes facts that simply aren't in evidence. Specifically, that evidence can be safely gathered and presented without compromising intelligence sources or putting witnesses at moral risk. Reality tells a different story. The UN reports 87% of Iraqi and Syrian court buildings are destroyed. 347,000 key witnesses are dead. 2.1 million displaced, and the rest severely traumatized. Public trials would compromise Australian signals, intelligence confirmed, classified in parliamentary briefings. Europe's experience shows their limits. Europol's 2022 report records a 64% acquittal rate due to insufficient admissible evidence. Viable alternatives exist. The UN Investigative Team for Accountability can run international tribunals at just 15% of the cost of domestic trials. Due process does not require importing security threats. Their plan would turn Australian courts into ISIS recruitment theatres, while real evidence remains buried. Is performative justice worth Australian lives, or should we rely on mechanisms that actually deliver accountability? Now on to my team summaries. My first speaker, Sophie, proved that importing ISIS participants creates a national security catastrophe, with European evidence showing 31% of recidivism rates and surveillance failures that guarantee Australian deaths. She demonstrated that children raised in terrorist families show dramatically higher rates of extremist engagement, while our federal police already struggle with monitoring existing threats. Sophie also exposed how repatriation forces 12,000 ISIS victims who fled to Australia to live alongside those who celebrated their persecution, violating justice and human dignity. She established the fundamental choice: does Australia exist to protect innocent people from terrorists, or protect terrorists from consequences? Sophie showed that true justice means safeguarding ISIS victims from those who joined their tormentors, choosing victim protection over perpetrator rehabilitation. Our second speaker, Andre, showed that repatriating ISIS brides and children is economically, morally, and socially catastrophic. Repatriation isn't just transport. Each returnee requires security, monitoring, psychological care, and social services, and schools. In 2022, the APF reported monitoring one returnee could cost $4 million a year, 300 officers, excluding housing and education. Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, as an Australian Muslim who has watched ISIS systematically murder, enslave, and terrorize Muslim communities across the Middle East, I stand before you tonight not as someone discriminating against my own faith, but as someone protecting it from those who perverted it into a weapon of genocide. The affirmative team stands with Australian families, ISIS victims, and the fundamental principle that the government exists to protect innocent people. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Zakine.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that Australia should not allow the repatriation of ISIS brides and their children. We, the negative team, strongly believe this statement to be false. I'll begin my speech tonight by rebutting some of the negative team's arguments, followed by a summary of our team's case. The negative team's first speaker has tried to rebut our first speaker's point on the ISIS women being somewhat innocent by saying that many of them actively chose to marry ISIS. I implore the affirmative team to look into some examples, some personal examples of these women. Some were underage, some were physically forced, some fell into the trap of the religious crusade propaganda which was online. Even if we say they're negligent, we cannot say that the conditions they're in right now and this clear violation of their rights, as our second speaker talked about, are justified. This is clearly untrue. The negative team's first speaker has also tried to tell you that the government's duties do not extend to terrorists. Can we realise that they've completely violated domestic and international rights of these people, as our second speaker talked about. This is a completely outlandish statement. And we also have precedent for this with people like David Hicks, as our second speaker talked about. He was a terrorist, he was a known terrorist. We're not saying these people are terrorists, but he was even worse. He'd been convicted of this, but he was still repatriated. This is a precedent we have set, and they are simply going against that. The negative team's first speaker has also tried to tell you that people will be scared of having these ISIS brides and children around them. First of all, this point had no statistical backing and was also a harsh generalisation with them simply making up anecdotal evidence. The negative team's first speaker talked about how there's national security risk for if these people committed acts of terrorism and also the spreading of these radical ideas. We are not suggesting that the Australian government releases these citizens in random law and expects them to integrate into society perfectly. We are not idiots. And we also realise there are related risks regarding if these people have instilled values. However, whilst recognising that the past is not a stark representation of what will happen in the future, we must analyse the patterns and trends from the 4 women and 21 children who have already been repatriated to Australia, as our first speaker talked about. According to the ABC, which he mentioned, excluding one woman who was charged for her alleged crimes committed when in ISIS, as our second speaker talked about, none of the women have committed any major crimes since their repatriation, and according to Human Rights Watch, the same can be said on an international scale as well, as our first speaker mentioned. The affirmative team kept on repeating the words, even just one woman. Let's look at this statement with some actual stats, unlike the negative team, where we've brought up examples, but they brought up examples, 2 examples of terrorist acts, but these were not specific to ISIS, brides and children. They were simply more general examples of people who came from terrorist environments. In fact, from publicly available records, the post-repatriation crime rate from around the 3,300 brides and children worldwide is considerably lower than the average crime rate, even in Australia, as our first speaker mentioned, which is about 1%. That would be 33 of these citizens. Keep in mind, spreading terrorist ideas is a crime and hence included in these statistics. We are not time travellers, and there is no definitive proof that further repatriated citizens will behave the same. However, we can extrapolate from the available data, as this is all we have. There's also a few reasons why these women have not been spreading these radical ideas, as we've talked about. The first reason for this is that lower crime rates, is that the ISIS society is extremely repressive, as our first speaker talked about. The women and children were not the ones holding the guns, and they were not the ones making decisions. We need to make that clear. There is something to be said about them being around radical ideas, but they are definitely not inherently violent or dangerous people who are inclined to spread these ideas. Many even growing up in Australia. They just have different religious and cultural views from their time in ISIS, and with enough education, these people will be able to make their own informed decisions and move away from these radical views. This is not our best guess. We've already seen this with the Australian citizens already repatriated, where the women subjected themselves, the 4 that came here, to voluntary order through working with Australian authorities to help reintegration despite having no legal obligation to do so. This is clear evidence that they are trying to integrate back into society. And a big reason for this is that they've seen in these ISIS camps, as we have reports from these people, as our first speaker talked about, the horrible conditions, and this has changed the minds of some of these people. The negative team's second speaker has talked about how it's expensive to bring them over here and care for them here. We entirely acknowledge that there will be a tax burden spent on these Australians, both bringing them home and caring for them. But the reason for this is entirely justifiable. It's blatantly apparent in this same statement. They are Australians. They are just as deserving as taxpayer dollars as every other citizen, and denying them this care would be a clear prejudice of Australia against certain groups of its people. This would have consequences on the international stage. How would this look to other countries, many of whom took in and cared for these repatriated citizens, the 3,300 figure that I mentioned before, if one of the richest countries in the world by GDP was unable to do so? What type of precedent are we setting for the future? The fact is, historically, we are not a nation that abandons our people, no matter who we are. Even the very worst, like David Hicks, as our second speaker talked about, who was convicted of joining Al-Qaeda, was still repatriated to Australia. Why are these citizens, many of whom are innocent, as our first speaker argued, being denied entry into their own country? This is going against international and domestic law, as our second speaker argued, and something we should be putting money into upholding these laws. Lastly, we are not talking about thousands of people. This is 34 people. These billions figures, I do not know where they got them from. If the government cannot fund the funds in its welfare system worth over $200 billion, we are doing something wrong. We have nearly 50,000 prisoners in this country, and even if they were all put to, let's say they had the same amount of tax dollars spent on them, for instance, for incarceration, this is still a minuscule amount of people. We have to look at the scale, which the affirmative team has not done. The affirmative team's second speaker has, in a rebuttal to our point, said that not all women were forced and many had active roles in recruitment. We do not dispute that some had active roles in recruitment, but we believe the affirmative team arguments that this means. But we believe the affirmative team's argument that this means we do not allow the repatriation is flawed. Firstly, disallowing repatriation on the basis of this would not only allow all those innocent children who have done nothing wrong, as our first speaker talked about, all the brides who were physically forced with their husbands, as our first speaker highlighted. It does not account for these people. We cannot create a ruling for the whole population on a minority. This is simply unconstitutional. If the affirmative team fits a one-size-fits-all logic was applied more broadly, if we use this logic more broadly, we would deny all refugees entry because a tiny minority commit crimes, or strip welfare from all recipients because a tiny number of them abuse the system. We need to look at this in this scale. They also said we also need to look at what is the better alternative to keeping these women. The better alternative is actually charging them here. We actually want to see due process done here. And the third speaker added on to this idea when bringing up new stats, talking about how there's a continuation of actively recruitment. They brought up many new stats such as this, like 80% were contributed to recruitment. But first of all, well, this doesn't actually seem very realistic considering that in Australia we've had 4 women and none of them have been found guilty. Therefore, this point of view is completely speculation and has no backing whatsoever in terms of the law. Now I'll summarise our team's case. Our first speaker, Seb, spoke about how the ISIS brides and their children are blameless, with children being innocent and many women being victims of coercion. He also spoke about how the repatriation prevents further radicalisation by allowing Australians to monitor, prosecute if necessary, and rehabilitate these citizens. Our second speaker, Vijay, spoke about the citizenship dilemma and explaining how disallowing repatriation breaches domestic and international law. In summation, this debate is not about excusing terrorism, it is about how Australia chooses to treat its own citizens. To deny them entry is to deny due process, to outsource justice to lawless camps, and to betray the very rights that protect us all. Australia must do better. Repatriate, do not abandon. Thank you.